Hello and welcome to our podcast, Talk Meme to Me. I'm FP2, your host who is so incredibly handsome, they gave me the only job that did not reveal my face. But all jest aside, this podcast is part of the Meme Project, led by the Godrej India Culture Lab's Leadership Program Fellows that seeks to figure out the origin, evolution and transmission of memes and memetic threads in India. That is to say, we are figuring out the way memes began, got passed around and evolved over time. Ladies and gentlemen, before we begin/continue with this podcast, I'll have you know that due to the current state of the world or everything, we have recorded this podcast remotely amongst a lot of technical constraints. So please excuse any issues with audio quality and blame Skype. Today's guest is a doctoral candidate at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, currently studying the role of memes in digital populism and social media. He has been associated with a project that looks into politics of religion and national belonging in South Asian online spaces. He has a master's in developmental studies from TIS, that is the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai. His work is so good, in fact, that when he agreed to do this podcast with us, I almost sprained my ankle dancing. Please give a huge round of applause for Krishanubi Niyog.
Thank you, Aditya, for the effusive praise. It's almost like you're setting me up for a fall. Well, thank you to you, and thank you to your colleagues in the Godrej India Culture Lab and the Meme Project for having given me this opportunity. And I would also at this moment like to thank all my friends who pushed me to go ahead with the podcast. I was a little bit hesitant as I had never done something like this before. And I would also like to thank them for all the help that they had provided me in my research in these last few years, finding out meme sites for me, helping me translate memes. Sometimes I don't get the references, especially when it comes to films from down south. So, telling me that this screenshot is from that movie and in that context and so on. So, yeah, let's begin, Aditya.
Yeah, honestly, even I'd like to thank your friends so much because, they allowed us to interview or to have a conversation with someone as great as you. Like, I've read your work and it's honestly amazing. Like, seriously.
Yeah, thank you again. You're like really boosting my self-esteem over here.
As someone who studies memes, on how internet memes became such a huge global phenomenon today, because, they're practically everywhere.
Well, the reason that internet memes have become so huge today, I think, would be because of two dynamics that are inherent to the whole memetic culture. And I would like to categorize them as inclusive and exclusive. The dynamic that leads to inclusion of more and more people, and at the same time, a dynamic that leads to exclusion of some people. In the inclusive dynamics part, I would like to include the obvious technological reasons, such as the advent of Adobe Photoshop in 1990 and its subsequent iterations that let you play around with images, insert texts into images, and form image macros. That's the traditional format of a meme. You have an image and then you have a text on top and at the bottom. Another important factor would be the advent of Web 2.0, which is a term that Tim O'Reilly had coined, and its associated concepts such as prosumers, which is an amalgamation of the words producers and consumers. So we are no longer just passive consumers of mediated content. We are also expected to be producers of media. And other concepts such as participatory culture, which is a term by Henry Jenkins, as you know very well. I think he had a master class with you guys. So participatory culture is a huge, explanatory concept when you study memes. So it involves looking at technology that has made it easier for people to share their creative artistic expressions with each other online and create connections, and these connections in turn lead to communities, and these communities are actually at the root of memetic culture. Those anonymous and pseudonymous online spaces such as image boards and the Cheeseburger network of websites. These are the spaces where meme making actually began. Another important factor driving, memetic culture, its popularity, is the playfulness that is involved in memes. The kind of juxtapositional humor you see, where you take elements from very, very different parts of your life or parts of culture and politics, and mash them together and remix them to create something entirely new. So you take the faces of chief ministerial candidates in the Delhi elections and superimpose them on the faces of wrestlers in a WWE match, that kind of a thing. And this sense of being playful like a trickster, pushing the boundaries of what is acceptable and unacceptable. And this is an area that I'll go into more detail, I hope to, as the conversation progresses. And memes are so popular simply because there's such an easy way of communication. They are light, they're humorous, they're banal, and almost inconsequential, to the point where somebody might actually question you, like, why are you doing research on memes? They are these meaningless, inconsequential things. But if you look at media scholarship that goes back a few decades at least, you'll find that a lot of them talk about the kind of hesitance and problems that people have, everyday citizens have, while talking about politics, out of fear of how it could impact their relationships, how it could have other adverse reactions. So memes for instance, make it easier to talk about politics, because you can slip in a political point or a pun through a meme, amongst the people who are a part of your network. So, and I'm telling you all of this because this is a real issue, as CSDS Lokniti's data from 2019 found that out of the 1/3 of India's voting population that does have access to social media, out of that 1/3, only 25% felt comfortable expressing themselves politically online.
Wow, only?
Yeah, only 25%. So not a whole lot of people feel comfortable talking about politics in digital spaces, on social media platforms or through chatting platforms. Another huge factor that drives the popularity of memes is the fact that it simply bypasses the need for formal literacy. So instead of a public sphere which is based solely around the written word, so I'm thinking of, say, a public sphere formed by news media, print publication, novels and literary works and so on, you have these artifacts, which are composed of elements drawn from popular culture. So when I say popular culture, I'm thinking of Bollywood, the film industries and cultures in southern India, television shows, music videos, popular speeches, celebrity images, and so on. So memes, because these elements that go into the construction of memes are drawn from popular culture, can now reach a much wider population, because you don't need a whole lot of formal education to understand the meme that involves, say, a screenshot from the movie Dhamal, which was quite a hit movie from back in the day, and it has given us many, meme templates that are quite popular in India. So this role of popular culture, which helps you bypass formal literacy, plays a huge role behind the popularity of memes, and because then you require a sort of cultural literacy, which is based on familiarity with, say, cinema and cinematic culture. And you'll find a lot of work by Indian scholars who have looked into film cultures in India and how it penetrates and percolates into sections of society that are underprivileged and might not have access to formal education. The last point I would like to make in terms of inclusivity would be that why does anything get done on social media in the first place? Why do we make memes or circulate them? Why do we tweet, or why do we put up posts? One explanation for that scholars have given, and I'm here thinking of Yochai Benkler, whose seminal 2006 work, Wealth of Networks, is a very relevant book even now, although it was written before social media platforms were very popular. So he talks about the kind of symbolic recognition you gain by sharing your artistic work, because it might make a very witty point, it might have a lot of biting sarcasm in it, So you gain some amount of prestige in social media networks by doing that. And coming to the potential for exclusion that memes have, when I'm talking about symbolic recognition, I'm talking also of the kind of pleasure and satisfaction that is involved. When you receive symbolic recognition of that sort, and there is a feeling of superiority attached to this, and this superiority can come in many ways. So the superiority could be because of the fact that the humor in the meme that you have shared or created is at the expense of someone else. It could be a political opponent, but it could also be someone in your family or your friends, or it could be someone belonging to marginalized communities. So that is one way in which superiority works and could create boundaries, to participation in memes. Another way would be to have the cultural capital or subcultural capital required to understand all the references that are included in a meme, or all the references that are made through the elements that have gone to the creation of a meme, the image itself or the video clip and so on. That could potentially create boundaries for people, as to who gets it and who does not. And of course, there is this factor of edginess or coolness, like I understand all the references being made in this meme, but somebody else does not, or I understood this meme first or saw it first before it became popular, and that sort of things. And these are cultural traits that have that are remnants from the places from which memes emerged, places like 4chan and its many boards.
I
And
feel kind of called out by that statement.
well, this kind of petty superiority matches are quite common in memetic cultures, and since all of us participate in it, I'm pretty sure it's something we can all relate to. This constant tussle for edginess, being an edgelord and so on. And this point about superiority and boundary creation and exclusion brings us to the point where, because memes are so playful and light and are always pushing boundaries of what is acceptable and appropriate, you can say stuff through memes that you wouldn't say in your normal everyday conversations. And this could mean you could work in really offensive and really discriminatory stuff into your memes. Now it could also work in the opposite way, stuff that is usually not allowed to be said in the public sphere, with regard to sexuality or gender and all of these things of lived experiences from the margin, could be expressed through memes.
So you could say that the anonymity of the memers basically allows them to have more confidence in posting said offensive or content that is not allowed, right?
Well, I wouldn't put it that way, because anonymity is something that you don't really have on social media platforms, the kind of architecture they have. Anonymity was possible in the kind of spaces where memes first came into being, before social media was a thing. So again, I'm going back to 4chan and Cheeseburger Network and all of these places. Also Reddit threads, that's a place where you have a lot of anonymity, but not in the kind of spaces we are talking about. So the exclusion that I'm talking about happens a lot through the humor of memes, the kind of edgy humor that I was talking about, this constant striving for edginess. So a lot of offensive content, they try to slip in a lot of offensive content, discrimination and bigotry under the radar, because of the kind of humor that is inherent in memes. And a lot of this has to do with the kind of irony and ironical distancing that you see in memes, and this comes up again and again in discussions about cyberculture and exclusion, because just joking is used as a defense when one sees offensive or bigoted content being shared. And the defense usually is in this way, that the content that has been put out is funny because of the cleverness involved in the joke. It is not because of the content of the joke, the bigoted content that is discriminatory towards marginalized communities, towards women, and so on. A lot of research by psychologists as well as activists from marginalized communities, they strongly argue that such discourses which are bigoted and discriminatory can have very strong adverse consequences and has a lot of potential for harm and exclusion. So, yeah, I mean, offensive and hateful narratives that cannot be said in normal conversation being worked in through memes is a huge problem, and it is a lot of people are trying to address that, and it is usually couched in this language of irony and ambiguity. But the dominant understanding now is that the final responsibility for deciding whether irony has actually worked in a particular instance, in a particular meme, or what that ironic meaning is, that decision is with the interpreter, with the reader of the meme, not the creator. So this is the main potential for exclusion that memes have, that has raised a lot of concern, and scholars of cyberculture such as Ryan Milner and Whitney Phillips, they talk about the creation of an in-group and out-group through the humor in memes, about who's laughing and who's being laughed at. There's always an us that is laughing and a them that is not, and the them that is not laughing is often determined by socio-economic and historical social location. There are other approaches to this issue. Some scholars take more of a Freudian psychoanalytic approach. They look at these issues through concepts such as taboo and repression and sublimation and how it relates to current politics. So I'm thinking of scholars such as Alenka Jupancis over here and her colleagues at the Ljubljana School, and also there are writers such as Angela Nagel, who had a book out a couple of years ago on the rise of cyberculture and how it relates to
Kill All Normies.
Yes, that book, and it looks at how cyberculture.
Coincidentally, I'm actually reading that book right now.
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, I must ask you your thoughts about it because it raised a lot of controversy. Although the book is an account of how cyberculture, the new cyberculture, including memes and the far right in the West are related, it has proved to be quite controversial. But what I have told you earlier about, humor creating in-groups and out-groups and the potential for exclusion through the humor in memes, that is the dominant understanding nowadays.
So then how would you bring this down to, Indian social realities such as maybe say discrimination based on religion, gender, caste, and how these are, translated into digital memes?
Yeah, so what you find when it comes to India is that, and a lot of scholars, I'm thinking of scholars such as Asa Doran and Professor Sahana Udupa, they have shown that initially India's cyber culture had a very pronounced middle class and upper class slant as well as upper caste slant, and this was reflected in the kind of memes that were circulating as well. And they might not always have been intentionally overtly exclusionary, but what you would find in them is a lack or an absence of lived experience from the margins, of those belonging to marginalized communities. And here I'm reminded of the Indian dad memes that were popular a long time ago, like 6-7 years ago. It had this very pronounced middle class bias in terms of the kind of experiences it was talking about.
Reminds me of the Sarabhai meme, Sarabhai versus Sarabhai meme. Have you seen that one where it's like, oh Monisha, this is so middle class?
Yes, I have seen those. Well, yeah, they are quite popular. They have become quite popular in the past month, I think, during this lockdown period. So, yeah, that reflects a particular Indian, reality with regard to how class works in Indian society. So this dominance that I mentioned about, middle and upper class Indians and upper caste Indians, it is still prevalent, but it is increasingly being challenged by voices coming from the margins, as well as a lot of vernacular language content that is prevalent in social media nowadays that is strongly challenging the dominance of English, or content in English. So when it comes to countering, these dominant narratives with regard to the Indian social realities of caste and gender and sexuality. The first instance that I can think of via the memes would be the Facebook page Inedible India. It had received media attention as well because of the freshness of its content and the kind of perspectives it brought. The page was started and run by Rajesh Rajamani, who was a banker from Bengaluru, and the page featured comic strips created by him, and the strips consisted of paintings by Raja Ravi Verma and miniature Mughal paintings as well. So what happens in these memes is that in each panel you find these paintings being repeated with different text captions, and it is through the text in these speech balloons that the socio-political commentary is being done, and they were very stinging, if I remember, and criticized the dominant narratives surrounding caste, gender, sexuality, and so on. There is also an evolving and established Ambedkarite ecology in Indian cyberspaces nowadays, and Ambedkarite meme pages are a part of it. When I say ecology, I'm thinking of sites such as Roundtable India. There are a lot of pages such as the Ambedkar Periyar Study Circle from IIT Mumbai. There's Dalit Camera. So along with that, there are a lot of Ambedkarite meme pages as well. I'm thinking of pages such as Badass Bahujan Memes, Just Savarna Things, Savarna Fat Cat, among others. And a lot of these groups began on Facebook and have since then moved on to Instagram. And so what you find in the memes in these groups is that, of course, they strongly criticize and contest the conservative and regressive social forces in our country and the kind of hierarchical structure of caste and gender and sexuality, but they also extend a critique of the kind of proclivities of upper caste and privileged Indians who consider themselves to be liberal. So they talk about the savior complex that upper caste liberal Indians have. So coming to Savarna Fat Cat, they use as their template, an old internet favorite, which is cats, and memes featuring cats go back to the time of, lolcats, which was a very, very popular template in the first decade of this millennium. So what you find in the memes in Savarna Fat Cat is the template is composed of a picture of a fat, plump cat which is just lazing around, perhaps symbolizing unearned privilege. And the criticism is then done through the text which is superimposed on these pictures, and they usually criticize things such as Indians who blame affirmative action policies and reservation for all the social ills that plague this country. They offer criticisms of the lack or absence of caste as an analytical factor in academic or socio-political discourses. And when it comes to Badass Bahujan memes and Just Savarna Things, they use stills from or screenshots from Bollywood and Hollywood movies as their template. And these screenshots are usually of characters delivering a dialogue or about to engage in some sort of action, and the commentary is done usually through text again, which is superimposed on the image in the classic meme format, and the text here plays the anchoring role. It holds down the meaning that the meme is trying to express. Of course, the image also plays an important role here in the overall meaning or political message that is intended to be delivered. And a lot of times they also use video clips, memes, mimetic videos. And some of these memes you'd be interested to perhaps know also feature important political and historical events from India, such as Dr. Ambedkar's demand for separate electorates in 1932 for the depressed classes. And these memes pages also use contemporary meme formats such as the ones you see across the globe, Feels Guy, Bojack, Filthy Frank, the one of Lisa Simpson standing in front of an empty screen, the one of Grant Gustin, who plays Flash in the DC television show, giving the victory sign in front of a gravestone. These are some of the recent formats I've seen being used. Yeah. So again, these memes go beyond the criticism of conservative Indian societal norms, and they also criticize other strands of politics in India, such as liberalism and the left. They question caste privilege. They question caste blindness of those upper caste Indians who believe they have transcended caste altogether. They criticize the NGO sector as well, and they have a lot of commentary that they deliver on through their memes on social and political events and protests that are ongoing. And because they are operating from a very strong Bahujan Ambedkarite standpoint, they also address issues of gender and sexuality. And then there are Twitter handles such as The Day Discourse of the writer Shivani Chandan, who makes memes from an Ambedkarite Bahujan standpoint. She also has a Tumblr blog that you might be interested in checking out. It has a lot of memes, and I here must express my gratitude to a friend of mine. She is the one who introduced me to her work, as well as pointing me towards the Desi Queer Memes Instagram page, which I am going to talk about next. So the Desi Queer Memes page has a lot of followers on Instagram, and they also use as the base template images and videos, video clips drawn from popular culture. So a lot of celebrity interviews, clips taken from TV shows such as Big Boss, Hindi serials such as Kasauti Zindagi Ki. They feature a lot of this character called Komolika. And these memes usually deal with, in a very humorous way, with queer lived experiences in India, and also features political satire on queer phobia that is seen in our country.
When you're talking about this political satire and all, right? How do you think that memes are used to question their representatives? Like, particularly, could you just comment on how memes can be employed to bring about some sort of changes?
The first impact or change that we could talk about that happens through memes is that they improve participation. And I've already talked about the concept of participatory culture that was started by Henry Jenkins and so on. So I'm talking about everyday lives of citizens and how they draw meaning from it. And this is important when it comes to exercising your citizenship and participation, and especially participation online. And this is not a neutral field, of course. There are a lot of power differentials here when it comes to issues of access and cultural and social capital, and what is considered as acceptable means of expression and so on. So that is one way where in which memes have an impact, I think. And because, and this is a point I have been stressing over and over again, because memes draw from popular culture, they make participation so much easier, and all the meme groups that I've spoken about, all the memes that I've spoken about are all related to draw their component elements from popular culture. So when you put forward a political commentary through them, you are engaging in you are trying to, in a way, shape the public conversations that are going on online in this country. And Henry Jenkins famously called it photoshopping for democracy. He was talking in the context of how people were engaging in conversations online during the 2008 American presidential elections, the one in which Barack Obama became the president. He was talking about the memes that people made of Obama and of his opponents, John McCain and the vice presidential candidate Sarah Palin. And it is in this context that he was talking about this term. The CK coined this phrase, photoshopping for democracy. As popular or mass visual culture usually encourages more participation than, say, your traditional print media circulation, the one of op-ed pieces and all of that. So it makes it easier for individuals to put forward their personal opinions in public. And another important way in which memes engender, and encourage participation is the fact that it begins with the individual, and this is something that Bennett and Segerberg talk about, the logic of connective action. So You take a popular meme format and you transform it based on your lived experience as as someone who belongs to a particular community, religious community, or a caste, or gender, or sexuality, and you put elements into it that reflects your experiences, and you put it out in the world based on your personal experiences. But at the same time, this also lets you make connections with other people who have had similar experiences, and this could lead to the formation of a collective, and this is something you see happening online a lot.
Since there's such relatability factor in all of these memes, right? So do you
Yeah.
think that memes do work only within, echo chambers, like with, or, people with similar ideological spectrums? Or do you think it's possible for memes to maybe, communicate between groups or say people who may not, see eye to eye?
Well, some amount of echo chamber formation is inevitable when it comes to social media platforms, because unless you try really hard to stay ahead of the algorithms, they are just going to show you content that you agree with or have agreed with in the past. And I think this applies to memes as well. But what I have seen is that often meme groups belonging to different sides of the political divide usually keep an eye on what the other side is doing, especially online. And Ryan Milner talks about this when he studied the Occupy Wall Street movement of the earlier that happened in the earlier part of this decade. He said that people who those who supported the movement and those who didn't, they were often seen to be using the same meme templates, and memes were popular means of expression during the course of this movement. So that is something you also see in India, as what usually happens is this thing called, that media scholars call mediation, or rather meta mediation. Yeah. So you take the social media post that your political opponents have made. Now this could be a celebrity, it could be a politician, it could be an activist. You take a screenshot of that and you embed that in a meme that you have made, and it could also be a video, and then you do the usual thing where you annotate it or superimpose text over it and make a satirical point, or make a joke at their expense as a means of putting forward a critique. It could be because they made a faux pas on social media, or it could be to expose hypocrisy by politicians, especially a politician you don't agree with, and maybe this politician had said something different when they're not in power, and now that they are in power, they're saying the complete opposite thing. So this is well in keeping with the kind of schadenfreude you see associated with memes, this tendency to evoke humor at the expense of others. So there is this kind of process happening. So there is some amount of conversation happening through memes, although they are not always cordial conversations, but there is some amount of conversation happening. Also because Indian meme groups, the political ones, also seem to sometimes use the same meme template to express very different political points. I've seen the Batman slapping Robin meme being used by so many different political meme pages. You see something of the sort of thing that the political philosopher Chantal Mouffe used to talk about, this agonistic, adversarial, and sometimes antagonistic kind of politics being carried out through memes between these different meme groups, because there is an us and there is a them, and just here not just talking about the marginalized and the privileged, but also between people belonging to different political ideologies. And so there is this tussle to establish dominance in cyberspaces, and memetic culture is one of the means through which they attempt to do it.
So when you speak of in groups and out groups, right? How would you say? How do you think that these said out groups and out grouped communities, the people who are being laughed at, as you'd say, right? How would they deal with the exclusion that happens through all the memes?
One example I could think of is in early 2017, the Ambedkarite website Roundtable India had taken action against certain casteist memes in certain Facebook groups, and they had also given out an advisory on the legal steps that could be taken in such cases. And you'll find a lot of Ambedkarite, progressive, feminist, and queer meme groups that are popular that try to create a counter discourse to the dominant bigotry and bigoted narratives and discrimination and exclusion that you see in certain memes, and they try to do it through meme culture itself. So again, religious discrimination is something that a lot of meme groups talk about. Here I'm thinking of groups such as Unofficial Subramanian Swami. It is quite popular, and it became popular because of a particular incident involving its administrator. So Subramanian Swami had filed a case with Facebook asking them to ban this page because it used to create memes ridiculing Subramanian Swami's statements. So what instead happened is Facebook blocked Subramanian Swami's own official page, and this other page. Yeah, that's what happened. Facebook by mistake blocked Subramanian Swami's official page, and this other page continued to function. So pages like this, they try to counter the narratives of narratives of exclusion aimed especially at religious minorities in India by making memes on very relevant topics such as contemporary topics such as the consumption of beef or the kind of lynching incidents that you see happening in India from time to time, communal violence and all of that. So these are some of the ways in which meme groups tend to, fight back against kind of exclusionary parts of cyberculture that you see in India by acknowledging and talking about the kind of damage and harm that it causes, but also by trying to create its own counter discourse through memes.
Yeah, looking back at the examples of the memes you use, like I remember the fat cat that you said, right? And it reminded me quite a lot of this meme. Just while the lockdown's going on, I'm just looking for so many memes, and this meme recently just came up on my feed. It was I think it was a meme by Meghnad S, who is like a public speaker, and he made this meme on Schrodinger's Ram Mandir, and where he used a cat as the main image, and where mixed concepts like Schrodinger's cat and the Ram Mandir entire thing.
Yes, I think I have come across that on Twitter. Yes, I've seen that particular meme. So so you see, that's the kind of contestation that happens through memes, and there you'll find a lot of memes that talk about Mandir wahi banayenge. So there's this kind of tussle again that I spoke of, to establish dominance in cyberspace through memes, and there is a lot of satisfaction and pleasure that is involved in doing so that research is on. So Professor Sahana Udupa talks about this, fun as a meta practice. So deriving fun and pleasure are inherent to these practices of making political memes. In addition, so there's this emotional component that is always involved in memetic culture, especially when you're putting forward a political commentary. And this is where a distinction has to be made, because I've spoken so much about the creation of in-groups and out-groups and discrimination and bigotry and harmful narratives against marginalized communities. Scholars also make a distinction between incivility and rudeness in cyberspace. So you cannot have a public discourse or a public conversation without sarcasm and wit and some amount of meanness and nastiness aimed at each other. So you need to maintain a distinction between what is merely rude and what is uncivil, behavior that leads to the exclusion of people. So because if you try to police and scrub the public sphere so clean that you allow nothing but the most rational and academic, kind of language that you might see in the newspaper, you will again end up excluding a lot of people who might not be using that particular kind of very staid expression. So yes, that is an important part of memetic culture actually.
Kind of brings to mind the current YouTube versus TikTok thing that's happening. When you say when you mention all the rudeness and all, and looking at how things are progressing currently with the entire issue.
Well, that particular case that you mentioned, I think it was far more than rudeness. I think as the queer group that actually took action against the video, I think it's Yes We Exist India. I think that is the name of the group, if I'm not mistaken, that brought this into public light. That that particular video featured a lot of queerphobic content. So it goes beyond being just being snarky and sarcastic. It reflects the potential for harm that such discourses can cause in the public sphere. So these networks would not exist without the circulation of content, content going round and round. So something like a meme being sent from one person to another, and the other person again reworks that and it says something completely different, and then he passes it on, and it goes on and on. Along with this circulation of content, through these networks, you also have the circulation of emotions, which is very important. And a lot of scholars, such as I'm thinking of Sara Ahmed here, talk about how emotions also work in a similar way. They circulate through people, through social networks. And when you have discriminatory content of this sort, of the sort that Yes We Exist India, the group was talking about, these sort of negative stereotypes start becoming adhesive. So Sara Ahmed calls it stickiness. So certain negative stereotypes start becoming associated more and more with certain populations, and then it becomes normalized to talk about them in a certain way. And that is why a lot of these meme groups try very hard to put up a counter discourse, of course through very humorous ways. And that is why a counter discourse is so important, even through memetic means. Of course, this sort of circuit of emotion, what I just spoke of, circulation of emotion, could also work in positive ways in social media. So you can send them across to friends just as a form of a greeting. Instead of saying hello, how are you doing, especially during this lockdown period, you send across a meme. And this is something I do, and some of my friends get really annoyed. They're like, why do you keep sending us memes? You spam our phones with all the memes and links you send. So these kind of fatigue networks keep fatigue communication, sorry. And when I say fatigue communication, I mean communication that is not meant to achieve an end goal, but rather to keep relationships and networks alive. So this kind of fatigue communication has the potential, to later on build up emotional intensity that could lead to meaningful socio-political change. And
yeah, I kind of also send all these memes to my friends, like as the lockdown's going on, and you just want to just tell them like, hey, look, I'm still here, remember me? I'm your friend. I'm just have a nice little decent laugh together with those emojis.
Yeah, I think we can all relate to that. And the important part about that is that there is a politics involved there too, because in the past this kind of communication was seen in very gendered terms. If you look at media studies going back a few decades, they considered women, especially who were confined to their houses, who spoke over the phone and were engaged in what was then considered idle gossiping. It actually, researchers found that such kind of conversations involved a lot of caring for each other, and keeping networks alive, sharing life experiences that were earlier not allowed to be put out in the public sphere, or was confined to the private household. So this kind of communication is also very important, and memetic culture allows you to do that. And that is another way in which memes can have a political potential. This kind of communicative networks are very important, although they were ignored in the past in favor of more overt forms of political communication involving speeches by political leaders, grand speeches and posters and all of that. People are now taking fatigue communication with memes, they're taking them seriously. And you see that happening in India as well. You could find a lot of cases where people have been put into jail because of memes, because they made memes of political leaders and circulated them. There are quite a few cases in the past couple of years.
So, Krishanu, since we're, kind of nearing the end of our podcast, I think I'd like to ask you probably the most important question. What meme are you and why?
Oh, me? Well, that is something that would require a lot of thought. Well, it would help me a lot if you tell me what meme are you and what meme do you relate to?
Well, personally for me, I'm just a massive fan of the anime memes of any kind. But recently I've gotten a lot into this anime called JoJo's Bizarre Adventure and the memes which are linked to those animes. To that anime.
I see that you're a man of culture as well, and I can very well see you going ora 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 on online forums. And I am a bit of an otaku myself.
But you still haven't really answered the main question. What meme are you though?
Well, let me put it this way. I would probably belong to those memes, I don't know if you've seen them, the awkward penguin kind of memes, that featured penguins. And I think the whole trend was called awkward penguins.
Yeah. I remember. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that would be the one I would relate to the most. And of course, some of the Feels Guy memes that I've seen, some variants of that, the Doomer memes and so on.
The Boomer memes?
Not the Boomer, the Doomer. That is a variant of the Feels Guy memes. I think the Wozak and Feels Guy kind of cluster. I relate to them only because of the music associated with them, stuff like The Cure, The Smiths, Slowdive, and so on.
So memes have been used to communicate a lot of socio-political messages. In a world where you can't really talk about your political identity or your political views, wrapping them up in memes really helps get that space or a mode of communication. Memes have been used to bring together communities and even tear them apart, because as you mentioned, there's always someone being laughed at. There will be both inclusions and exclusions, and they can be either caused or shouted out by memes. When I say shouted out by memes, I mean like memes can be used to call those negatives out. You pointed, hinted and referenced towards so many really interesting works, from works like Angelica Neagle's Kill All Normies to the Facebook page Hindu Nationalist Anime Girls, and he showed how all of these are important in the building of memes, that each and every one of them is essential. Alongside that, you also gave like this timeline or a framework of understanding memes. And thank you, for refilling my 2C list, with such seminal works from all across the digital landscape. And I'm truly, genuinely grateful. I have so much to see and so much more to think about, because you've provided me with such a brilliant way of unraveling memes. Thank you for coming and joining us on this podcast.
Thank you guys. Thank you so much.
And to our listeners, thank you so much for listening. If you want more of this quality content, log on to www.memeprojectindia.com, where you'll find more podcasts, a timeline of memes, blogs, videos, and so much more. I repeat, www.memeprojectindia.com.